Hi, welcome. In this video, I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss the issue of reconciling the reaction of a dog. Now, this is where getting into the issue of defining physical force through an interaction and what actually sets up and promotes change at the relational level. It's understanding how a dog's mind is influenced and governed at the social relational level, understanding how this ties into the personality type of the person, these issues of power control, but then actually looking at how the dog responds to certain levels of influence, and then gauging that and looking at that to assess, looking at the terms of getting a baseline, say, well, is it reasonable? And so, even I make the distinction between corrective and relational influence. And so here in this system, at the relational level, it's being proactive. It's not, corrective type of approach is based on a reactive level where you're waiting. You're actually, interpreting the dog's, body language, and you're waiting until the mind goes over the top before you're engaging the dog or you're assessing at that level. Here, it's like getting a three-dimensional view of the relationship, knowing that, well, the dog is holding power in the relationship, tying it all together, connecting all the right dots, and then asking the question, how do you move the relationship from point A to point B based on dogs, how they think that way, and tying it into the person that way. And then looking at the whole issue, again, going deeper here and looking at the issue of understanding motives in response, and this picture of change that is very much how the mainstream dog training world looks at change, but understanding the problem in that. So when I'm bringing the relational change and script online, I'm bypassing working within quadrants. And again, I talk about in another video why that's a problem based on how people think, based on what that represents with promoting change in and through the person. And so therefore, what you do is you're bypassing that, and you're looking at how nature defines what's reasonable, or what represents the process itself, based on the type of influence that's being used to advance change. And so again, when you look at the issue about defining again what's reasonable, and then the issue of using a motivator, okay, this is where I talk about why I stay away from incentivizing, building the picture that way through incentivizing, even using positive reward-based type of language, verbalizing, even incentivizing with certain motivating agents. That can be a problem based on, again, how people think. But it's really going deeper than that and saying, well, actually getting the dog, understanding that dogs will come into agreement, okay, with the process based on what's reasonable. And again, this ties into the reaction of the dog. Now, this is where it's very, very difficult for people because, the culture of thinking that really where we're at in society is that people will look at the reaction of the dog, even though it can be very unreasonable. The dog is really challenging. I'm really kicking back on the leash when influence comes online. Again, a reasonable amount of influence, what's reasonable, but then people tie into that reaction and they get overly emotional about it and they can't move on. They're at a crisis point. But that goes right, if you look at their thinking, that will tie into why they're in the mess that they are to begin with, because their thinking is not following a path of leadership. They're emotionally invested in the dog at too high of a level, and they can't get out of it. And so, when they get this reaction going on, it really bothers them. And again, this is another relational kind of scripting change where I will tie it into coaching the person. If I know I'm going to get those high reactions, even based on, what's reasonable, but it's really contrasting, say, off my personality type, you'll want to coach that owner because the reaction levels will be lower. Of course, you don't want them to not change. They have to change how they think, but the dog thinks and knows it has control over that owner, so it's not gonna go in such a challenged state. but don't be deceived. I mean, don't the dog. There has to be that. Okay, there definitely has to. The script has to come online, and the person's way of thinking has to change. But again, getting back to this issue of the response, just understand it's very, very difficult for people to reconcile that based on how a dog's responding to what's reasonable. But again, it's really tying this all together for people. It can be really difficult for people to reconcile this, but it's really critical, even out of the starting gate, to not get caught up into this picture of things. When I'm doing the method, it's very intentional, it's very scripted. It has to hold true, has to hold together. And so when you see the leash technique, there's a reason for that. Okay, it's not about starting to invest in the positions that way. When I'm using a sit position, it's not for the typical obedience way of thinking. It's an interaction. It's my staging area to set up these what I call them follower moments, where influence takes hold, and you build off the building blocks of change that way. That's what creates change, is these follower moments. It changes the moment you're in, and you see the head turn in towards you slightly, but it also begins to impact the dog's overall decision-making process as these moments build off each other day after day. That's what creates change. But again, you have to really be able to step back far enough to see the process. And even when I don't use commands, that's very challenging for the mainstream thinking, because how people think. But you really have to think about that. I mean, if you're already walking on sand and the dog already perceives you as weak, and you try to use verbal language that way, it's not going to work. Okay? I mean, dogs, and again, getting in this issue of intent in communication, as you move forward based on what's reasonable, okay, the type of influence, the dog knows the intent, okay, that you are communicating with the dog, just at a deeper level, at a nature level. So anyway, just something to think about. If you have questions about this system of training, it's very, very effective. It really pushes all the foolishness aside. It makes sure the motives clean up properly. That's critical, especially when you have dogs that are holding a lot of power. You may be dealing with an aggressive situation. If you get involved in certain training approaches, even though they advocate leadership, it's the specifics of the method itself that matter beyond just the idea of leadership. You want to make sure everything sets up properly. You want a system that takes you into the relational trenches with really changing how you think, how you interact. And yes, it will be challenging, but getting the right information makes all the difference in the world. If once it's explained properly about the reactions of the dog, you'll be able to deal with it. You'll be able to reconcile it. You're not going to be upset. It's not about being abusive to a dog, not hurting the dog. It's not about physical force that way. It's about what's reasonable. And in a dog, in nature understands that. I mean, typically dogs, it makes sense to the dog. Dogs know that you have their best interests at heart. You're not going in as a bully. You're going in just as a parent, so to speak, and it's about what's reasonable. But it's very, the method itself needs to be very intentional, very scripted, very defined, and then you maximize results. You get to where you need to go faster. So anyway, if you have any questions, let me know. I'll be more than happy to answer them.